The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November 2018 Expertise in Business webinar series. I'm Eric Hobbs, President of Technology Associates, and I'll be your moderator for today. So first, a quick bit of info. I'm with Technology Associates, and Technology Associates is a technology solutions provider based here in Cary, North Carolina. And we have a proprietary process that we call Insight that help our clients across North Carolina with between 20 and 200 employees solve real-world business issues, increasing their productivity and eliminating hidden risks, and thereby reducing overall support costs. So if you'd like to learn more, I'd love to set up time to chat. So ends the shameless plug. So what y'all came here for today is Cyber Fortress, data protection for your business. And we're happy to have Mike DePalma, a data protection expert from Datto, here with us. So Mike has spoken alongside members of the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, cybersecurity experts to ensure that businesses have the right protection in place to protect their business. First, a little bit about Datto. They're headquartered in Norwalk, Connecticut, offices in 22 countries. They protect over 450 petabytes of data in private data centers across the globe. And many of you may not have heard of them, and it's simply because they work with partners like us all over the world. And fair disclosure, we've been relying on Datto for many, many years, and we've been super happy with the results. Hence, we thought it would be a good idea to bring Mike on. So first, a couple housekeeping items. If you have questions, type them into your GoToWebinar chat box, and I'll get them to the presenter. Shortly after the webinar, I'll post a recording, and everybody is going to get a link to the recording. If you have topics that you'd like to see us cover in future webinars, shoot me an email. My email's on the screen. And our next webinar is going to be Tuesday, December the 18th. We'll be hosting Dan from ID Agent, and he's going to share with us the underbelly of the internet, the dark web, how it all works, and how you can protect yourself against that. So for more information, go to technologyassociates.net/webinars. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mike.
Appreciate that, Eric. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us. So as Eric mentioned, I get to go around. I do a lot of presentations, panels, cybersecurity summits. I get to present in front of what they call ethical hackers, guys that used to be on the bad side and now have moved to the good side. And so I hear a lot of stories. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about are real-world scenarios and real-world examples of what's out there and some of the threats, and ultimately kind of where backup fits into that. Because obviously it's a multi-layered approach to try to combat these folks, but at the end of the day, your backup is your last line of defense. And when I'm out talking to small businesses, medium-sized businesses, for the most part, folks are using backup. I very rarely talk to a small business that's not backing up their data in some form or fashion. Now, for the most part, the folks that are handling it in-house, they're using traditional forms of backup. Right? They're either using an external hard drive, tape backup, which as I travel around North America, you see a lot of that still. And then the shift to the cloud. We're seeing a lot of folks move their data back up to the cloud, which is great. You've got a second copy of your data, different geographical locations. For the most part, it's pretty secure. So that's great. But the problem with these traditional forms of backup is that they have limitations that the criminals are very well aware of, and they know ways to exploit that, right? So, as we look through some of these limitations that we see, first and foremost, we typically see higher failure rates. It really goes for any kind of commoditized piece of technology that you can go out and buy on your own. You're going to see higher failure rates, especially if you're still using tape. You could see study after study that will show you the failure rates of tape backup anywhere from 30 to 40% in some instances. And so criminals love that, right? They want to see the higher failure rate because especially if they're deploying a ransomware attack and they've got your data, if they're relying on the fact that, hey, there's a good chance even though they're backing up their data, they're not going to get it back, that gives them some leverage, right? And so some of the other limitations that we see, obviously just risk of infection or theft. A lot of times when I'm talking to businesses, they've got their one form of backup on premise, or they have their IT person drive it home with them and keep it at their house over the weekend. And these are risky. You could walk into small businesses and find their backup solution in an unlocked data rack right in their lobby, things like that. And so just the risk of actual infection or theft are there. And if you're not encrypting your data, they not only have access to it, but you have no way of getting that data back. And so that's one of the real good pieces of leverage they have. The other big thing, and I was actually on a panel up at Microsoft's Burlington, Massachusetts office a couple weeks back, and they asked the panelists, what the biggest threat is out there. And the very first panelist, who was from Microsoft, said user error. That's just the reality of it. A lot of times what these attacks are relying upon is user error, and not malicious intent from the employee themselves, but just, day-to-day user error. And so if you've got somebody manually taking those backups, or more importantly, manually testing those backups, there becomes more possibility for these user errors. And I could talk to folks all over the country, and for the most part, they could tell me how often they're taking these backups. They feel pretty confident in that. But when I ask them, okay, the next step, who's testing these backups and how often are you testing them? Now you start to see a lot of finger pointing. I assume Jim down the hall is testing those backups. I think we assigned that to him a few years back. I think he's doing that. We don't know how often he's doing it, but he's testing them. All another just great piece of leverage for these criminals. But the most important piece that they have, especially when we're talking about ransomware, is the slow recovery time. Right? How long is it going to take you to recover? For the most part, folks can tell me how often they're taking their backups, but they don't know that. They don't know the answer to how long it's going to take them to get up and running. And so when the criminals are going to say, okay, pay me my ransom, and you decide I don't want to, but you're looking at several days of downtime, now that cost of the downtime is far greater than the cost of the actual data loss. And so just to kind of further explain that and what that looks like, I want you to take away two acronyms. And there's a million acronyms in technology, and you could sit through webinars or presentations, and you'll get inundated with those. But the two that are most important, the two that the criminals are very well aware of and know that they can exploit, are your RPO and your RTO. RPO is your recovery point objective out on the left-hand side of that screen. Simply put, that's how much data are you at risk of losing at any given time, right? So if you're taking daily backups, you run the risk of losing a full day's worth of data, hourly backup, weekly backup, so on and so forth. And so you have to make sure that that RPO is aggressive enough for you. And that's there is no right or wrong answer to it. Every business, every industry, every size business is going to have a different RPO goal. Some folks can absorb losing a day's worth of data. Other folks can't absorb losing 15 minutes of data. The only caveat to that left-hand side of the screen, the RPO piece, is if you're not testing your backups, there's no way you could honestly answer that question. Because you could say, hey, we take hourly backups. Been doing it for years. Then you get hit with a ransomware virus, or just your server crashes, and you go to restore. You find out your backup's been failing for 3 weeks. Now that star on the left-hand side of the screen jumps from 1 hour to 3 weeks. And now you're in some trouble. But for the most part, folks feel pretty confident that they've taken care of that side of the screen, right? For the most part. The piece on the right-hand side of the screen is the real piece of leverage these criminals have. That's your RTO, your recovery time objective. Basically, how long would you be down if your servers were to be locked up for whatever reason? Would it be 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks? We talked about, the shift to the cloud, which is great, but if you've got several terabytes of data up in the cloud, and you're trying to pull all that data back so you can get into a production environment, you're looking at days or weeks, in some instances, to get all of that data back. So you have to be able to answer that question. You have to be able to say, okay, how much data am I at risk of losing, and how much downtime am I at risk of incurring? I actually just was at a presentation this morning that I presented, and then there was a panel, and the provider that I was there with mentioned a statistic that said a small business that's down for a week or more has a 60% chance of closing its doors within 6 months because they're never able to fully recover. And so that is a real threat out there for small businesses. So we want to be able to answer both of these questions. How much data are you at risk of losing, and figure out how much downtime you have.
Yeah, and I'll kind of chime in because we actually have a customer now who became a customer because of this RTO issue. And they were multi-location engineering firm, 40 employees. Their former provider had sold them on this cheap cloud backup. They are doing the backup. They even tested it. They recovered a couple of files, and I'm sure you've seen that as the quote unquote test. Then they had a serious server issue, and it took them weeks and weeks to fully recover and get all the data downloaded and rebuilt and put into functioning systems. And for those, for that owner of that business, it was a shock that they didn't know that they weren't told that beforehand.
Yeah, and I see that time and time again where, folks like Eric will go out and talk about all the options, and then it doesn't necessarily resonate until something like this happens. And then they say, whoa, I wasn't protected. And the problem is it's too late to go back and try to implement something like this. And, it's a huge risk out there. And so again, that's something you have to be able to answer. The lost data piece, but more importantly, that downtime piece, which most folks can't answer when I have that conversation. So regardless of what you have, I'd really encourage you to go back after this webinar and try to answer those questions. And then the tough part about that RTO side is, okay, we can answer the question for how much downtime would we would incur, but what is that cost? How much would it cost us to be down for 8 hours, 24 hours, a week? It's going to differ for every single business that is on this webinar. So you have to kind of do some research on your own and try to come up with that. And that's just the baseline revenue loss. It's really hard to measure how many clients you might lose, how many future clients you might lose, just the industry hit you would take in terms of your status in that industry. These are the type of things that we're trying to address. And so as we move along, we start looking at some of the threats out there. On that same panel, when folks were asking everybody on the panel what their biggest threat was, of course, I'm the last one to go, so all the easy, low-hanging fruit answers were taken. So I said, well, to me, the biggest threat is the folks that are behind these attacks. Because for the most part, people think this is the guy in his basement, right, doing these attacks so he doesn't have to go out and get a real job. Or the folks that used to do them and go on the web and brag to their hacker friends, hey, did you see that news article? That was me. I was behind that. And that was all great. But now there's so much money to be made that we're seeing the shift from, the individual hackers to organized crime or even scarier entities. So I go around, I try to find interesting variants of ransomware in particular so that I could see, most folks are familiar with CryptoLocker or some of the more prevalent ones, WannaCry, which we saw last year. But there's some really evil ones out there that don't get the publicity they should. One of those is called Popcorn Time. Now, Popcorn Time ransomware is individually pretty evil. What they do is they're going to infect a network, traditional way of doing it, usually a spear phishing email attack. So they're going to get you to open an email that looks like every other email in your inbox and either click on an attachment or a hyperlink. And you're going to get this scary red screen that says, please pay me my money in Bitcoin. But this particular variant gives you a second option. They say, okay, you don't want to pay me? Why don't you go out and infect 2 other businesses for me? And once I see that you've successfully done that, I'm going to unencrypt your data. So scary stuff, right? They're asking you to do their work for them as almost a pyramid scheme to increase their business. So I was on a panel a couple of weeks back, and there was again, an ethical hacker, right? Somebody who really understands this world. And he interrupted me as I was telling the story, and he said, well, I'm very well aware of this variant, and we in the cyber hacking community believe it's actually much more nefarious than even that. They believe that these criminals don't even care if you pay the ransom. The actual goal is to impact our economy and create distrust in our economy. And it's not too far-fetched because the big attack that happened after WannaCry last year was NotPetya. That's already been tied back to the Russian government. And the idea for them was we're going to impact the Ukrainian economy. But obviously, once a virus gets out into the world, it's going to impact economies everywhere in all different kinds of countries. And so the scary part about this is you're really looking at the small business community being used in some instances as just pawns in a greater game. And we're seeing all different types of industries be attacked. Now, the problem is that the attacks that are being reported upon are the very large attacks. The city of Atlanta. Most folks have seen the story of the city of Atlanta get attacked with ransomware. Right? This is now a sensational story. One of the largest cities in the country getting impacted by ransomware. And so if you start to break down the dollar figures that are associated with this attack, it goes back to that RTO piece that we talked about. Now, this attack in particular, the criminals asked for $52,000. Seems like a large amount, but you think about the city of Atlanta. That's not a huge amount of money. Now, they never listed whether they paid that or not. We feel like they probably did, but let's assume that they did, and now that they've paid $52,000. Now, an article came out just a few weeks after the attack where the city acknowledged that their costs already within a month exceeded $2.7 million. This was for outside consultant fees, legal fees, the cost of setting up this Bitcoin account, all the lost production, and all the rest. Now, a few months later, they had to go back to the city and ask for another $9.5 million to clean up all of the ripple effects that happened during this attack. So now their total investment for a $52,000 ransomware hit was over $12 million. Now, these numbers are very high, so it's hard to kind of relate, but they're always going to be scalable. $52,000 ransomware ask instead of a $12 million investment into addressing this attack. And to give you some perspective, the annual IT budget for the city of Atlanta is $35 million. Now, a third of that went to addressing the problem of this specific ransomware attack. That math is always going to be there. They're going to price that ransomware attack at a more attractive price than the cost of downtime. And so this is what we see. And unfortunately, a lot of municipalities, police departments, they are not well equipped. You think they would be, but they're a lot of times using antiquated ways of backing up their data, trying to handle it in-house. And these are the type of issues that we see. So these are the type of very large examples that we see. City of Atlanta, police departments, large hospitals. That's what the news organizations are going to cover because that's going to get clicks and all the rest. But the problem is the vast majority of these attacks are occurring at the SMB level. And that's a scary proposition. We here in Connecticut, we're based up in Connecticut, Dado, and we had an attack on our judicial branch recently. And that got locked up. Just last week, the city of West Haven, which is a suburb of New Haven, had their entire city's data locked up with a ransomware attack. So you could just Google a story in your area, in any industry, you're going to find examples of this. It is truly becoming an epidemic that we're all trying to address, right? And so as we move along and we start to look at who's actually being attacked, we actually are seeing a much greater attack at the SMB level. So here at Data, we did a ransomware survey. It was actually the largest survey of its kind, and we actually put out a new one today for 2018 that came out about an hour ago, so we weren't able to update the numbers, but this was from 2007. And what we found, what we did was we interviewed two groups of people. We interviewed the managed services community, and we interviewed the small business community. And when we talked to small businesses that were attacked, the average payment was only about $2,000. Not a ton of money. Again, they want you to pay at the small business level so that they can get on and get their money and move on to the next victim. But take a step back. About $1 billion worldwide changed hands between the business community and the criminals. Now, in North America alone, $301 million of that came from the SMB space. Now, take $301 million and break it down into $2,000 increments. Now you really start to see the size of this net that they're casting and how many folks are not only being attacked, but have no other recourse but to pay. Think about it if you're, again, these are criminal enterprises, organized crime. There's two business models. You can be the home run hitter and go after the large Fortune 500 companies and hope that you get a 6 or 7 figure payout. You're going to have a lower success rate. It's going to take you a lot more time. Or you could be the singles hitter and say, I'm going to attack dozens of small businesses every single week, knowing that I'm going to get a large amount of those folks to pay. And so we're seeing a lot of that because small businesses, for the most part, aren't very protected, and they have a less of a chance of recovering and recouping back to a traditional production environment, right? They can't absorb that downtime. The city of Atlanta can go back to the council and say, hey, we need to bond off some more money, and they're not going to shut down. A small business doesn't have the ability to do that, and that's why they're such an attractive victim for these criminals.
So let me ask you this: you drew the comparison between singles and home run hitters, and I question, even the thing with Atlanta, that was probably just a singles attack, and they just lucked up when they figured out who it was that they had actually snared in. They didn't go after the city of Atlanta, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And we really saw that with that WannaCry attack. And for those of you that didn't see it, in May of last year, it was a single virus that impacted, in a single day, 220,000 computers, 150 countries. And that was indiscriminate. They were just trying to get it out, and sometimes they hit a large bank or a municipality, and sometimes they didn't. So, yeah, we see that. And the fact that they only asked for $52,000 makes me think that they probably didn't realize that they were going to get this big whale of the city of Atlanta, because they could have sure gotten more than that out of the city of Atlanta. So you're exactly right.
So here's a question from somebody. So if somebody is infected with ransomware, what's the best practice? Pay or don't pay?
Oh, definitely don't pay. And that comes from the government right on down. There's a couple of reasons for it. The government doesn't want you to do it because it emboldens these guys kind of at the macro level. But on the micro level, there's a decent chance you're not going to get your money back. Remember, I talked about the pawns here. Last year, it was estimated about 75% of the folks that paid the ransom got at least a piece of their data back and were able to get back up and running. That number is now in the low 60s. So you've got a 4 in 10 chance of going out, setting up a Bitcoin account, funding it, getting it all paid, and not getting your data back. But beyond that, it puts a bigger bullseye on your back, right? I mean, think about the bully in the cafeteria. You pay them some money, your lunch money, they're going to keep going until you stop paying. So if you're not addressing the problem, first of all, if you're not cleaning up your server, that now is laying dormant in the background, and it's definitely going to pop back up. But even if you do clean up the server, they're going to say, hey, we got this guy to pay for $2,000. Let's go out and hit him again and ask for $5,000. And we've seen a lot of examples of that, especially at the small business level. So there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't pay. A lot of folks say, okay, I don't have to worry about it. If I do get hit, worst case scenario, I go set up a Bitcoin account and I pay. That's the exact opposite of what you should be doing. And so
I think when we did this test, you had kind of given some examples of, I think you guys were testing this or a business, and setting up a Bitcoin account and making that stuff work is not an overnight thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting because there's 4 people on my team that go around and do these educational seminars. And since we talk about Bitcoin so much, they wanted us to have a Bitcoin account so we could speak intelligently about it. And for those of you, a very brief overview of Bitcoin, it's an online anonymous currency created with this kind of utopian idea that we're going to have a currency that can't be artificially manipulated by governments, inflated, deflated. It's truly going to be driven by actual market. Right? So that was the idea. But because it was anonymous, it was very attractive to the criminal community. And so we started seeing drugs and guns and things in the dark web being sold with Bitcoin. But the criminals were smart enough to say, hey, we've got this ransomware virus that's very easy for us to deliver through email. And we could marry that with our Bitcoin, and we could, we can be very successful with very low risk of getting caught. And so what we did, we got $100 funded into our Bitcoin account. I went and set up a Bitcoin account, went to an exchange, got the email from Dado that said, okay, we funded your account. It took 6 days to get that $100 into my account. And by the time it got there, it was only worth $87. And so again, you don't walk into a bank and say, hey, I need $52,000 in Bitcoin. It takes a while to get it funded. And that's the reality of it. So yeah, there's a lot of ripple effects that go into this, and to think that, okay, I'll just set up a Bitcoin account and pay it and get my business back up and running. That's just not the way folks should be looking at it. And so when we look at some of the other, we talk about those ripple effects. So we talk to those businesses that were hit. Over half of them reported data loss, whether they paid or didn't pay. And 75% reported that business threatening downtime that we talked about at the top of the webinar. That's 60% of those folks that couldn't absorb this downtime. So 75%, 3 in 4, reported that business threatening downtime that put them on the verge of closing their doors. And so again, this is the ripple effect. The actual payment of this ransom is really just pennies compared to what the actual impact is. And that goes for really any size business. So that's what we're really looking at. But the stat that these criminals love to see, I mentioned that we talked to 2 different buckets of folks, right? The managed services community, right? Folks like Erica out there that live and breathe this stuff. 9 in 10 of them were highly concerned about ransomware, pretty much in line with what we thought. Small business community, less than 4 in 10 were highly concerned about it. And then, remember, we didn't do this survey until we started on July 1st of 2017. And so this was after WannaCry, where everybody should have heard the story. And still less than 4 in 10 were highly concerned about it. Criminals love this. And even within that 38%, a lot of folks are highly concerned, but they haven't made the investment to protect themselves. And so they know that this is not an epidemic that's going away because it's so lucrative, and folks still aren't worried about it, despite the reports that are coming out from the government and the cyber community. It's just not resonating for some reason in the small business community, and the criminals are just, gobbling up this Bitcoin at record amounts.
In your study here, that 38% of SMBs were concerned about ransomware. That doesn't really translate into the number that are actually protected, specifically when we talked about the recovery time objectives that we referenced earlier. So, obviously we're in a little different ballpark in that 99.9% of our customers are nailed down on a bunch of different fronts, but we see this consistently when we onboard new customers. It's like, wow, you guys are really, really out there on the edge here.
Yeah, and what we see, and it happens time and time again, I do a lot of live presentations, webinars, and people come away from it scared, and they say, okay, I need to get protected. And then life happens, and they start going about their day, and then weeks go by and months go by, and they haven't addressed it. And we see that all the time. And the idea that you're going to be able to handle this in-house for the most part is very, very difficult. To keep up with all the threats, all the technologies out there, the multi-layered approach, it's very difficult. And that's why, the importance of working with an outside managed service provider who's put together a package of solutions, that multi-layered approach that they know works. It really is the best way to go, for sure. So yeah, that's what we see. And it's a great point, Eric.
Our second official shameless plug, correct?
That was for the industry in general, but yes, these folks are very great. Shameless plug. So how are these guys getting in? They do it various different ways. It used to be you get that email from your long lost uncle or the Nigerian prince that says, "Hey, give me $5,000, and in a couple of weeks I'm going to send you your $1 million inheritance." Nobody's falling for that anymore. The emails that come in with typos, and it's very obvious that they're not real emails. That's not what these guys are doing. They're doing what's called spear phishing and socially engineered phishing to try to gather some information about you. So when they send out that email, it's going to look like every other email in your inbox. And so I did a presentation down in Allentown, Pennsylvania, about a year and a half ago. It was right after the WannaCry attack, and the keynote was a gentleman from the FBI. And so he's given this really scary presentation about cyber warfare and all these different things. And he finishes with ransomware, because at the time it was really the hot button topic of the day. In the middle of his scary presentation, he stops and he shows this picture of this beautiful house. And he says, "Anybody recognize this house?" Now, there's 150 people in this audience, and the guy in the back goes, "Hey, that's my house. It's a beautiful house, sir. This is great. And you just got a promotion at work a couple of weeks ago. It's fantastic." He starts rattling off all these stats about this guy in the back of the room, and he finally says, "I bet you think that I use all the tools at my disposal at the FBI to figure out all this information about you. That's not what I did. What I did was I talked to the organizer of this event. I got a list of registrants, and I picked one of you at random. The first thing I did was I found you on LinkedIn, and I had your business as part of the registration, so I knew that I found the right person. And then I got your face, and I said, okay, I got some information about you. Let me see if I can find you on Facebook, and that's where I got this picture of your beautiful house. And then I went to try to find you on Twitter and Instagram and all these social media platforms. And within 10 minutes, I had a good sense of who you were and where you worked and what you did. And so what I would do if I was a criminal, I'd start with some low-hanging fruit. I'm going to say, okay, graduated. The example he gave with this gentleman, he graduated from Penn State University. He says, I know Penn State's got one of the largest alumni associations and the most active alumni association in America. So I'm going to set up an email. It's going to look like every other email you've ever gotten from the Alumni Association, same template. Email address is going to look similar unless you scroll over it. And it's going to say, hey, click here for all the information you need about your 20-year reunion festivities. And you're going to click on it because it looks like every other email in your inbox. And maybe you don't, you're suspicious, you don't see that. So I'm going to go down and I'm going to say, okay, let me look at some of your coworkers, and I'll try an email that looks like it comes from your coworker or somebody in finance or one of your clients that I could see, or your previous employers. And one of these days, it's going to be a Friday, you're trying to clean up your inbox, and I'm going to catch you asleep at the wheel. You're going to click on this, and I'm going to now have you infected. And the best day for me to infect you is on Friday, because hopefully you go home and your company doesn't know that you've been infected over the whole weekend. And that's the type of stuff that they're doing. So they could do some homework up front. Eric mentioned the example that sometimes they hit folks that they didn't really mean to, like the city of Atlanta, and they got lucky. But there's folks that will spend some time here knowing that their success rate will be much higher. And so they'll know you have a Verizon account. They're going to send it saying, hey, reset your password to Verizon, or Netflix. They're going to assume everybody's got Netflix, and they're going to say, reset your password to this and click on this link. And we see it time and time again. I get them all the time from Apple and all these things. And when you scroll over the actual email address, you'll see, hey, this isn't going back to Apple. This is going back to some crazy domain with 1 million various letters in it. And so that's what we're seeing. That's the sophistication that we're up against. And that's why they're so successful. So, we've seen that just time and time again. And so the next logical question I get asked all the time is, okay, what's the government doing about this? What are they doing? And so I have a pretty easy answer for them. They do 3 things. First, they're going to investigate. The problem is they're not catching very many of these folks. That FBI agent down in Philadelphia office that I presented with in Allentown said in 6 years they haven't caught anyone on the ransomware front. So their investigation is more to find some of the vulnerabilities that they're seeing. And so what they do is they take that and they go out to phase 2, which is to educate, which is why you're seeing more and more FBI agents out in the field trying to educate the business community. But then ultimately, what does the government do? What do they love to do? They want to regulate, right? We're seeing regulations come down all throughout the country on a state-by-state level, industry-by-industry level. And they, the politicians want to go back to their constituents and say, I propose this legislation, I acknowledge this epidemic, and all the rest. And so that's what we're seeing. And I know, Eric, you've got some pretty aggressive regulations coming down where you are, correct?
Yeah, so I did a post on this. I don't know, it's probably been about 9 months ago, where legislation was introduced here in the state of North Carolina to reclass ransomware as a data breach. So in effect, what would happen? Obviously these well-regulated industries, under HIPAA and FINRA and all these guys, they know that if they get something like this, they have to report it. Your traditional small business at this point really does not. They're not forced to do that. But if the state of North Carolina does reclass ransomware as a breach, then there are reporting responsibilities for any business located here in North Carolina or that does business with customers in North Carolina, in much the same way that GDPR did, in that you get ransomware, you're going to have to report it to the state, you're going to have to notify all your customers. And as part of that, they also reclassed what personally identifiable information is. So the 100% the states are on top of this and ramping up their efforts to make sure that small businesses are forced to report these incidents where they haven't been in the past.
Right, and we're seeing, right, because a lot of small businesses weren't reporting it because they figured the FBI is not going to do anything about my $2,000 ransomware ask, and they don't want to be the business that's known for getting attacked, right? That's bad for your reputation. And so you mentioned GDPR. Actually, part of the presentation I did today, there was a gentleman who went through GDPR, and in an hour, it still was only the tip of the iceberg to be a real expert in GDPR. But this was a European regulation that came down, and anybody that's doing business with any business in Europe has to abide by it. But it really is the strictest compliance issue that we're seeing out in the world, and we're seeing that kind of move to the states on a state-by-state basis because that's how regulations work here. And so we're seeing some really strong regulations in the financial industry up here in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Connecticut, and it varies again region by region, industry by industry. But when you look at what these regulations really are doing, at the end of the day, all of them, whether it's New York City or North Carolina, they're really not stopping any of these criminals from doing these attacks, right? They're really not catching any of these criminals through these regulations. There's really nothing that the government's going to do. What they're really doing is shifting that burden over to the small business community and saying, this is what's out there. It's your job as a small business to make sure that your data is all protected. And there's a laundry list of things that you now have to do to be compliant to avoid those fines. And a lot of times when I'm talking to small businesses, they are as concerned about the regulations surrounding these attacks as they are about the actual attacks. And so to become an expert internally about what these regulations mean and then implementing those regulations to make sure you're compliant, it becomes extremely difficult and extremely time consuming and costly to try to handle that all in-house. And so, to stay abreast of all these things is very difficult. And they usually happen pretty quickly. The legislation will pass and they'll give you, 12 to 18 months to make sure you're completely compliant. And so even if some of these strict regulations haven't impacted your business yet, now is the time to start implementing technology to make sure you're compliant. And that's really what we, encourage you to do. Because again, what are they doing? They're shifting that burden over to the small businesses. To really say it's your job to do that.
And they are, and I haven't seen any legislation, and I doubt there will be any that, really comes down on you if there's a breach. What they're really looking for is, have you done your due diligence and adhered to best practices to prevent this from impacting your customers and the data that your customers are trusting you with? So, if that's in place, that's really what they're looking for, at least in the HIPAA compliance audits that we've been involved in. They just don't want to what they're looking for is to make sure you're not willfully ignorant of this as an issue.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just that you've shown best practices to protect your data and your client's data. It's typically what they're looking for. And so, right. So but understanding that is the first battle, and that's what we're seeing on the governmental level. Absolutely. It's a good point. So when I go and do presentations, typically they're to specific industries, whether it's a dental association organization, CPA firms, legal firms. And what I'll do is, I'll look at the national organization. So if it's a dental organization, I'm going to look at the ADA and see, what they're saying, what they're telling their members are the common pitfalls or the tips that they need. And they vary slightly, but they're all pretty much the same. We usually find the same 5 or 6 bullet points: not understanding your cyber risks, The folks that don't feel, the 60% of businesses that don't feel they should be highly concerned about ransomware. That's not understanding the risks that are out there and the threats that are out there. That's first and foremost. That's why we encourage these type of educational pieces. So next, just focusing solely on protection. There's a thought out there that, okay, Q1 we're going to address our security issues and we're going to take care of it, and they'll make an investment into some antivirus, anti-malware, anti-intrusion protection. We're going to make, and then they close the book and say, okay, now we're done. We addressed that. Now Q2 we'll look at something else. That's not how this works. It's got to be a multi-layered approach, and as the threats evolve, you've got to be able to evolve with them. So focusing solely on protection is not the way to go about this. A lot of great vendors out there that can protect these data breaches. Nobody's going to guarantee it. So it's got to be a multi-layered approach for sure. So you're not testing your backups. That comes up time and time again. We talked about that on the RPO side. It kind of goes without saying. You have to be testing them. It's a waste of time and money to be taking these backups and not test them. So that's pretty clear. Not educating your staff. Hopefully everyone that's on this webinar can go back and share this information with the rest of the team. Everyone at every level and every department should understand these risks, what they should be looking out for, and follow-up steps to make sure that everyone understands these risks. It's very critical because we see that. And the person that clicks on it the most, the departments that click on it the most are the C-level folks. We find the owners of the company, the CEOs, CFOs. They're the ones that are falling for it. I'm sure you've seen it as well, Eric.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. So not seeking outside help. This is a somewhat shameless plug for you, Eric, but this came right from the pitfalls that the CPA organization said. But again, trying to handle this all in-house, right? I mean, this is it's difficult. So not seeking outside help is really a pitfall. And then lastly, and I think the most important piece is the framework aspect of it. Fire alarm goes off. Every single person in the organization knows what they're due, hopefully. But if somebody gets that scary red screen, do they know what to do? I could tell you at my previous job, if I got that scary red screen, do I want to walk down the hall and tell my boss, hey, we just infected our network with ransomware and it was my fault? No, I'm going to try to handle it in-house, or I have a friend down the hall who's somewhat techie. I could bring him down and try to fix it. And the longer it sits there, the more networks it's going to impact. So everyone should know the moment the breach occurs and it's been identified, what do I do? Who do I call? What are these next steps? That's critical, and that's something that should be reviewed upon onboarding any new employees and then reviewed at least on a quarterly basis with the staff. Does everybody know? They could be very brief, but here's our procedures. Write them down. Make sure everyone in the organization knows them. Very critical.
Okay, so I've got a question posted here about backups. And so I get the question is basically, how do you know, what is a good test for backups? And I think that in looking at the question, it's kind of, my comment earlier is even though the engineering firm had downloaded a couple of files to quote unquote test, they didn't go through the full process. So maybe talk a little bit about kind of your guys' recommendation on when a backup is quote unquote tested properly.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of folks their testing will just be, okay, we saw that the backup occurred, but you really have to test the integrity of that backup, and that goes through actually seeing what that backup is, trying to restore a file and make sure that it's there. So again, it's not just, okay, here's a check mark saying that a backup occurred, but was the backup actually successful? So that you avoid the pitfall that you talked about with your client, the example you gave earlier. Make sure that the integrity of that data is there.
Well, and I'll go another step, that the full recovery is done. And I know that's hard for smaller businesses to do, but I think that goes back to your point. And another question from one of the people here is about the 30 to 40% failure rates. So I'll grant you that if you have kind of traditional tape backup or whatever, backup to drives, you're probably seeing success. The failure rate, I'm sure, is probably more talking about going to full recoveries. And look, I've been burned many a times, which is why we do manually verified backups. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how your product addresses this, but ensuring that backup can be stood back up, can be stood up to the company so they can get back to work. And if you can get to that point and know how long it takes and that everything works properly, now you've got a tested backup.
Exactly. And that's really what you need to be doing. Absolutely.
Yep. So hopefully that answers that question.
Right. So I mentioned I want to give a couple examples of what that cost of RTO looks like, what that cost of the downtime looks like. Because as I mentioned, everybody's got a backup solution. They could take care of that left-hand side of the screen. They feel comfortable with that. But what does that cost of downtime look like? And we talked about the city of Atlanta, but I've got a couple other examples that I want to cover that shows that. And they're large examples, but they're scalable. That math is always going to be there. It's always going to be cheaper in your mind to pay that ransom than it is to incur that downtime. And so the first one I want to talk about is one that I've been talking about for several years, but a lot of folks really aren't aware of. And that's the San Francisco Metro Transit Authority. And so they get hit with ransomware. This was Black Friday of 2016. These guys know when to hit, right? They know when to hit it when it hurts the most. So they get asked for $73,000, and they immediately put out a statement saying they have no intention of paying this ransom. Government recommends that we don't. We're not going to deal with these type of extortion tactics. We're going to restore from our backup. Now, obviously, San Francisco Metro Transit Authority's got a pretty robust IT system. The problem was that the systems that got hit were their fare collection system. So they were, as this system was down, they were unable to collect fares on the light rail and the bus system. And so they had two options at this point, because they went back to their IT team and said, how long is it going to take us to get back up and running? They had done some testing. They said, we know we can get back up and running by Sunday morning. So now they're looking at 2 days of downtime. So their first option is to shut down the light rail and the bus system on the two busiest shopping days of the year, which clearly isn't an option. Or door number two, which was to give away free rides. And that's what they did. They gave away free rides on Black Friday and the subsequent Saturday. So now the residents of San Francisco, they love ransomware, right? It's a feel-good story. They went out there and they got free rides. And they got to, do all their shopping for free. And that was great. And so we didn't see a ton of follow-up stories about what the cost of this downtime really was. But fortunately for me, I can go to their website and I could do this math pretty easily for them. And again, it's just a baseline number. So you go to their website and they say, okay, their network's down. They provide 735,000 rides every single day. They don't break down how many of these folks are riding the bus or the light rail, but I could tell you it's $1 to ride the bus, $2.25 to jump on the light rail. So they're down for 2 days. They lost anywhere between $1.5 and $3.3 million just in lost fares, not in the outside consultant fees, not in the overtime, the loss of production, all the rest. This was the baseline number. This number is probably closer to $5 to $10 million, but this is the type of money we're looking at. Again, $73,000 in ransom versus several million dollars in the cost of that downtime. This math is always going to be there, and that's why they're getting so many folks to pay. I mentioned that the FBI agent in New York City that I presented alongside of a few months back, he gave the same story, and I presented right after him. And he stole my story, including some of the same pictures, and he brought it all the way up to here, and he talked about the cost of downtime, and he said, I don't know how much money they lost. I can tell you that it happened here in Manhattan. It's $50 million a day. That's the type of cost of that downtime. And so we're always going to see that math. Obviously, if they hit Manhattan, they're probably going to ask for more than $73,000 if they were to get through. But again, this is what the criminals want to do. They want to make sure that they could price as much as possible, but they want you to pay as well. So that's what we're seeing. But this is me and the FBI doing some math. I've got an example that's actually third-party vetted that really addresses that cost of downtime. And this was from a panel I sat on with a gentleman from the cybersecurity insurance industry, which is a different conversation for a different day. It's something you should, look into. But he gave an example about an actual client of his. It was a utility company out in Lansing, Michigan. Now, this utility company had their own internal staff of over 50 folks. And so when they got hit with ransomware and asked for $25,000, they said, we can handle this in-house. They spent a full day trying to do that. And after a day, they had to say, hey, we've got no other recourse but to set up a Bitcoin account and pay this ransom, or we're never going to get our data back. We thought we were protected, but we're not. And so now these folks were down for a full week. They were down for a week before they got up to true production. And so they had a cybersecurity insurance plan, which is why this gentleman was talking about it, right? And so as we move forward, we look at, okay, they're down for a week. What does that look like? They put together a claim for the cost of downtime. It was covered under their cybersecurity insurance plan. And their initial claim was $2.4 million. When they looked at it, what was this impact? $2.4 million. Now they addressed it and said, okay, $400,000 of that was system upgrades that we really needed. We couldn't include this into our loss of production claim, but their actual claim was $2 million. Now they submit that to their cybersecurity insurance company. My experience with insurance companies, they're not going to pay on anything that's not a real cost. And so they want to vet it as closely as possible. And after a while, they vetted it and they wound up cutting a check for $1.9 million. Now this guy's now pounding his chest saying this is why you need cybersecurity insurance. After we got off the panel, I picked his brain a little bit because for me, I looked at it another way. This is now a third party vetting all of these costs and justifying these examples that I've been giving. $25,000 in ransom, which they paid, but the actual cost of downtime was $2 million. This is the type of math that we're talking about. And the ripple effects, again, on this go even further as well. So this is a third-party vetted. That cost of downtime, trying to identify what that is extremely important, because that cost is always going to be priced higher, for sure. And so with that, we do have some time left for questions. I know a couple questions came in, which were great as we were presenting, but I do want to open it up and see if there's any questions you have for myself or Eric. We've got some time left, so fire away.
Yep. So we've got a couple, and the 30 to 40% failure rate question came back up, and I think I can address this. We certainly don't feel like 30 to 40% of the time your backups will fail to back up. I imagine so. If you've got a software that's running there, one in every 3 backups isn't going to get a failure alert. It's the recovery side of it. So make sure that you're looking at that side of it. So I want to touch on just real quick here, Michael, and I know this isn't a commercial for Datto, but talk a little bit about your product and kind of how it addresses this. And we use the Cirrus version for the online or the local recovery, and we like it. And we picked it specifically for our customers, purely to get over that full recovery drill, because small businesses don't have extra servers laying around that you can throw backups on and do a full recovery drill. The Cirrus kind of tackles that in a different way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually, when it was created, it wasn't really created specifically around ransomware, but the way we back up data is a little bit different. And it kind of eliminates that risk. So first and foremost, it's a hybrid solution. So we mentioned earlier on about some of the limitations about having your one backup on premise or a mile down the road. What we have our own data centers. We've got 9 around the world. We actually protect over 450 petabytes of data. It's one of the largest data centers. And so you would have an on-premise device that are backing up that server or multiple servers, and it's automatically replicating to our 2 data centers. We've got one in Pennsylvania and one out in Utah. So we selected those locations because there's multiple copies in different geographical locations. So beyond even a ransomware attack, but if you have a fire or flood in your area, you now have multiple copies of your data. So that's first and foremost. Second thing is the testing aspect of it. It's automatically going to get tested. It's going to be tested on every single backup, and also the offsite sync is going to be tested. So every single backup is going to make sure that that data is there and valid. And there's testing on the virtualization side, which I just want to close with. But it's also an image-based solution. So whereas those traditional forms that I talked about, they're backing up files and folders for the most part. With an image base, we actually take a snapshot of that entire server. We're capturing the operating systems, the applications, everything. Once we get that base image, now you set up that schedule of hourly or whatever you want to do, and all of those backups, because we're just taking incremental block level changes, they're all independent of one another. This is how we combat ransomware. There's no risk of it impacting previous backups. So if you get hit at 11 o'clock a.m., you could roll back and take that time machine back to 10 a.m., and you know that data is there. And it also gives us the ability to virtualize. And this is really how you combat that downtime cost. And what that means is because we've captured the operating systems, the applications, everything that lived on that server, you get that scary red screen, you'd call up Eric and his team, he'd be able to spin up what's called a virtual machine right from the Datto device. And everyone that was working off of that server is now working off of this on-premise device. For the most part, people in the office won't even know that you're working on it for that device. And it's a true production environment. It's not just giving you access to these files and folders. It's really business as usual. And we're taking backups when they're at state. And so you could be in that state for a few hours, a few days, even a few weeks while that server that was infected gets wiped clean or replaced. And then we get all of that data, including the changes while you're in that state, over to that new piece of hardware. So we've now eliminated that downtime. We reduced it from days or weeks to minutes or hours, depending on how large your system is. And that's really what the solution does that is much different than traditional backup. Business continuity looks at it in a much different way. The idea of keeping your business, like I said, business continuity, keeping your business up and running, because that downtime, again, is that biggest threat.
Yeah,
So,
we used to, you talk about the RTO, and it used to be, get out the tapes, fix the hardware, reinstall the operating system, reinstall the drivers, restore the data, keep your fingers crossed. And the reason we picked Datto is the RTO, really. I mean, obviously there's a lot of other things in it, but, boom, being able to boot that virtual image and get our customer back up and running while we deal with the stuff in the background, worth its weight in gold. So next question, is cybersecurity insurance worth it? Well, that's that's a big question. I will tell you,
Yeah.
I'll answer first, and I'll kind of let you kind of chime in, Michael. I actually did a webinar on this, on cybersecurity insurance coverage, with a good friend of mine, Stuart Powell, and it's on our webinar page. So go take a look at that. He goes into a lot of pros and cons around this. But in general, Mike, what's your thought on cybersecurity insurance?
Yeah, I think it's a fit for most businesses, and I think with the issue with it and kind of the reputation of it was when it first came out, there was no actuary tables to be able to really underwrite it. So the dollar amounts are really high, and they scared away a lot of people because, insurance companies, they want to get as much data as possible. It's very easy to do a life insurance policy because you look at actuary tables and you say, okay, this is the average lifespan. We work back from there, and if they smoke and don't smoke. Whereas with cybersecurity insurance, it took them some time to get some real data. And so now I think that the actual rates are pretty much in line with what they should be. And I recommend it. I mean, I'm not in the industry. I've done a lot of presentation along folks. Again, it comes down to individual businesses. Like we talk about business continuity, it's not a fit for everybody. Maybe you don't need it. Maybe you can absorb being down for a week, or, you got to look at an individual basis. But I think you have to start looking at, what would impact your business and what that cost would be. And for the most part, for most businesses, there's probably a policy out there that makes sense. And I don't know if you agree with me on that, Eric.
Yeah, 100%. I think obviously it's a case-by-case basis. I think most people have the impression that cybersecurity insurance is going to start cutting you checks for getting your business back up and running in much the same way that fire insurance would, or whatever. But I don't think it quite exactly works that way. And again, I'd refer people back to the other webinar. But for me, the big thing, and we help customers. It seems like once a month we're filling out a cybersecurity insurance, a questionnaire for somebody to get coverage. The big thing for me is the costs in the ancillary damages around, buying, the LifeLock and stuff for customers that data is exposed, and all that other stuff that, are kind of add-on costs that are above and beyond, kind of getting your business back up and running.
Right.
Yeah. So costs. Yeah, good question. Probably not something we can answer on the webinar, just because it's going to vary a lot. If you want to get with me offline, I'm happy to kind of run through some cost scenarios with you. But I can tell you from experience in working with data for many years, it's very, very reasonable and affordable based on what you get and the recovery that you get for it. So I think that's the end of the questions. I think I've got them all. So yeah, look, Mike, thanks again. I really appreciate this in kind of helping us get the word out for our customers and prospects around, what is a pretty darn important topic. So anything in closing?
No, I think that, the important thing is to go back and take a look at what you have. Again, you very well might be completely covered, but it's very important to go back and, again, look at that RPO, look at that RTO. Am I protected well enough? Do I feel comfortable, and can I absorb that downtime? I mean, I hope that's what people take away from it, and do some research on your own. You can go down a wormhole, Google stories, and you'll spend 8 hours scaring yourself and keeping yourself up at night. But that's what I would really recommend.
Yeah, awesome. Well, listen, once again, I appreciate your help, Mike. And anybody has any other questions for Mike or myself, please shoot me an email, ehobbs@technologyassociates.net, and we'll get back to you right away. So thanks again, Mike.
Thank you again, Eric. Yep, thank you for having me.